Hey everybody, this is Dr. Maples. We're continuing our lectures on observations. In our last lecture, we talked a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of observations. In this one, I want to start thinking about how you as a student would prepare for your first observation and observations that may come after that. Now, interestingly enough, observations are going to begin the same way as all of our other studies. We always begin by drafting a research question, more importantly, a sociological research question. And remember, this question may change itself as we start to think more about hypotheses we might want to examine, or even variables that we're particularly interested in measuring. But we start with a research question. Once we've developed a research question, we can also start to develop some testable hypotheses based on what we might find. Now, when I say what we might find, this could be what you personally think that you might find. This could be what other theorists or writers or scholars in a particular field have found, and we think that we'll find again and more. This goes back to some of the basics of how we develop research from the ground up. You'll also, too, as you build your hypotheses, be thinking about variables that you're able to measure. Now, for observations, variables can be a little tricky because we're often thinking about what we can see in terms of actions or the interactions of how other people live their lives. It takes some practice sometimes to work on the variables, but you go through that same process of defining them, conceptualizing them, and then telling us how you'll measure them or operationalizing the variables. But these are the basics. You do this for every study. You would do this for a survey. You would do this for an interview. You would do this for observations. You'd also do this for content analysis, our fourth approach that we talk about, and many of the other approaches. In fact, when we start doing secondary data analysis, we'll again do these very same things. Once we have these basics in mind, we really have to start about something that might be less obvious, and that's how we're going to observe something and where we're going to observe it. It may not be obvious that you're going to do that, so I kind of want to spend some time thinking about that. Now, when we frame research questions and observations, we're often thinking about how people might interact or behave in a particular space. And if you look carefully, by magic with observations, we often find that the place that you might want to conduct an observation will pop up in your research questions or even in a hypothesis. Let's take my first example here. I want to understand how perceptions of race might shape how individuals treat food court workers. Right away, it's clear that I'm doing an observation in a food court because I'm interested in how maybe a potential customer's perception of the clerk's race might shape this relationship. And I'm interested in how that might impact things in a food court area. Food courts, by the way, a great place to people watch. That is one of the places when I was in graduate school and even as an undergrad I really took interest in because people let their guards down in food courts. It's a very unique place too because you can watch lots of people from lots of different angles. Another example, I want to explore how perceptions of age might help shape how police interact with people around campus. So if someone is younger, do they automatically assume that they're an EKU student, and would that shape this relationship? Well, it seems very obvious that the areas I'm going to be watching are on the borders between the city of, say, Richmond and EKU campus. And again, all these other examples, I try to tie back to a particular place. Now, there's other situations where that might not be clear, and that's okay. In fact, let's use our first example again. What if I'm interested in how perceptions of race might shape how a customer would treat a clerk at a restaurant? In that case, a restaurant is going to be my area for observation, but it could be any number of kinds of restaurants. It could be fast food, it could be full service. So I could be sitting at the Applebee's. I probably won't be sitting at the Applebee's, but I could be sitting at the Applebee's, or I could sit at Lee's Famous Recipe and be watching people based on different approaches to how I might want to look at this relationship. There's no single right answer. Now, as you pick a location, sometimes you can work that back into your research question, even though you've already crafted that. Remember, those questions can change with time. And likewise, you may even decide that you want to adjust your hypotheses. You may even find, too, that if multiple locations would have been a possibility, maybe you need to narrow down your hypotheses and your variables to this specific instance and treat the other areas as a different study altogether. So, for example, what if I wanted to think about how perceptions of race might shape individuals treating restaurant workers at fast food restaurants? That could be one study. And then I could see how these same things could shape people at sit-down restaurants. That would be a whole separate study because fast food and sit-down restaurants are just very different. Now, you're gonna look through this and try to understand where you should conduct your study. There's no, again, right or wrong answer. You're going to be the person that kind of has to pick that. So you choose what works given your resources. Likewise, too, as a student, you may pick a project that is something that could be in lots of different places. So you may simply have to work with what you have available in terms of your resources. And that's okay. We do the research that we can. And if we want to do bigger research in the future, then we try to get funding for it and do that. Let's talk about a few more early steps here. One of the biggest decisions that you have to make in doing any observation is to what degree you're going to interact with the environment. You fill a certain role in this process. And what I always suggest for undergraduate students, at least until they have some experience, is doing what we call the non-obtrusive study. Now, with a non-obtrusive observation, you're literally a fly on the wall. Not literally. You're figuratively a fly on the wall. You're sitting there watching. You're not interacting. You're not really doing something. You're not even putting yourself in a conspicuous spot that people might interact with you. You try to put yourself on the periphery or the edges of what you're trying to observe, and you just stay out of the way. And I think this one's really good because it gives a chance for people to interact as they normally would, and it reduces any opportunity for you to maybe change what's happening because of your presence. Now, there's also, as you gain more experience or as you move up in terms of being a graduate student, doing an obtrusive study is also okay. And this is where you put yourself in a situation that you might end up interacting with others, and that's okay. It also could be something where you're going to intentionally interact with others to see how it shapes their behaviors. This might be a good example of what we call ethnomethodology, where by interrupting society, we try to understand the norms of our society. These are also called breaching experiments, if you've ever heard that phrase. With an obtrusive study, we do make some important decisions because we may engage in what we call deception, or what your textbook likes to call covert research. I've never heard anyone else use that term, but I thought that was kind of a cool one, covert research. By covert research, this means simply that we aren't telling people who we are, or we're maybe not being entirely forthcoming about who we are. I want to give an example of an observation and ethnographic study that I did in West Virginia. We were studying historic mountain cemeteries there, and we were in a situation that we could be forthcoming and say, hey, we are graduate students at the University of Tennessee, and we're here to study you. But would that have changed things? Because we were going to be interacting with people and interacting with the environment. What we chose to do was be less forthcoming about that. We're people who are here. We're not going to necessarily come out and say we're students and that we're following you and we're going to study you and study your behaviors in cemeteries and so forth. So we did engage in a bit of deception in that sense. You have to be thoughtful about to what degree deception is appropriate. This is also something, remember the institutional review board we talked about way back at the first weeks of the semester? This is something that you would also have to clear with them, that you're going to not be forthcoming about who you are. In cases where you're doing really in-depth ethnographies too, you should really go through a period of time where you notify the people that you've studied about the work that you're doing and talk about how you've treated their data. But that is for a more advanced class. Some of the other things that you need to think about, whether it's non-obtrusive or obtrusive, is are you actually able to be in this space? So we're obviously not going to be able to do observations in federal buildings that are closed off to the public at certain times. That's not going to work. You can't be there, so it's going to be limiting. Likewise, this is where ascribed statuses come back in. Now, for those who may not remember, ascribed statuses include things like your sex, gender, class, race, so forth, that are traits, and they're all social constructs, but they're things that are applied to us by society, whether we wanted them or not. They're usually given to us at our birth. We're told, for the rest of your life, you're going to be considered female. And because of that, people will treat you differently. So we do have to be aware, will your ascribed statuses come into play in you being able to be present in a space? Does that also impact what you might see? Does your presence change things? These are some of the things that we have to consider while we're setting up the observation. And it's not something that stops the observation, but it is something that we want to make note of in our notes, our field notes, which we'll talk about in a moment. Likewise, too, we can realize that we know people who can help bring us into spaces. This is particularly thinking about ethnographies a little bit here, where We have contacts who are able to put us into places that we might not otherwise be able to be. But again, that's probably getting more engaged. That's certainly getting into the edge of the obtrusive study and probably heading into the realm of the ethnography. Now, ethnographies are sort of a hybrid mix of obtrusive and non-obtrusive. Part of your time you're spending watching and listening and learning, but much of your time is spent doing effectively interviews of sorts, not formal interviews, but more like conversations in the true sense. And within these, we often engage in deception with an ethnography. These include usually two approaches. One is the Martian, where you approach and you know nothing about this, and so you want to learn more about it so that you can understand it. The second one is the new convert, where you're a person who is now taking on these identities and you want to learn them. Again, these are both kind of advanced ideas. They're not things for you to be considering engaging in as undergraduate students, but for those of you who might go to graduate school someday, they are something to consider. That is where we're going to leave this lecture off. Now, in our next lecture, we're going to start talking about field notes. And field notes are how we collect data from our observations. If you have questions about what we've talked about so far, reach out to me, chat with me, send me an email, show up for office hours. I'm happy to help. Otherwise, I will see you in our next lecture. Take care.